board. And I understand that Harris Stute had something to share with us this evening, so you have the floor.
I'm Randy Stute. I teach the high school, and I'm really only here to represent my colleagues really quickly. Coming to a meeting tonight, I already have a meeting at 6, so I'm going to have to leave out of here as well. And I hope they do have an opportunity to go through all the projects and have lots of good questions for these people. But I wanted to be very supportive that a lot of these things are desperately needed, and I'm assuming that you're going to go through and have good questions and have priorities set on these, which projects you're planning on doing and support. And so I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and then I will listen to whatever I have to say at the end. And I know that there's been a lot of discussion on this board about debt and bonding and support in the past, and I know that some of that has come into the form of expecting or thinking this board might have gone far in nice places. I hope that in the end, whatever is decided on this process, and I look forward, as I said, to hearing what it is, that if you decide that a piece of it or something you don't want to do, that you have good reason for that, you make it clear, you identify the community. I think it's important to not just call into question the whole process without actually identifying what it is that you want to say. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I like your shirt. Oh, oh dear. Okay. And we're back. So with that, I think, are you up for?
I'm up to introduce.
Yes, you're up to introduce, so go ahead.
So we're here to start reviewing the fiscal plan like we do each year at about this time. And then from there, we're going to also consider how general obligation bond might fit into the discussed plan, and such as we've kind of discussed in previous Friday notes. But at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Mike Reuter so that he can bring us up to speed with regard to the adjustments he's made to the fiscal plan due to the most recent data. Mr. Reuter, thank you.
Good evening, board. Yes.
Could I just one thing?
Sure.
I think sometimes there's been some question from patrons on the live stream. Just to be clear, we have these documents that you are presenting up there here on our screens. And so if some of us turn around and look at there and some of us are looking at our screens, none of us are ignoring you.
Thank you.
Today.
I can do my best Vanna White.
Okay. Well, but,
It looked like it was on though, Mr. Reuter.
yeah, this red is not real bright.
Okay.
Yeah.
There it is. Yeah.
Okay. Well, good evening, board. I typically would come to your public hearing and present an update on a fiscal plan and kind of a precursor to what adoption might look like. So I am a little earlier than normal, not by a lot, but we do have most things certified at this point. And so, not that it's totally time sensitive, but we do want to have a conversation about potentially issuing some general obligation bonds. And that has a little longer lead time to that if we want to try, excuse me, thank you. You're welcome. That has a little longer lead time to it if we'd like to get that process started. But I'm going to really cover everything in the fiscal plan, and we'll save the debt conversation for last because that'll involve the administration and Baker Tilly as well. So I'm going to start on page 48, and if you're following along on the electronic copy, it's a PDF. That would be page 50 because you got to count for the cover and the table of contents. But if you go to page 58, now we don't have, we have not certified our ADM, but Dr. Greiner has provided me an enrollment update as of the 21st of August. And so, oh, maybe a little too far there. Back a little. I'm sorry, page 48. Did I say 58? Yeah. I'm sorry, page 48. Enrollment. Mm-hmm. Okay. Michelle, you probably got to go to page 50. So you have to add 2 to that. There we go. Enrollment. So if you're following along on your computer with the PDF, you'll see, just to recap, 2023-24, we did lose some enrollment last year. We lost 67 kids, and unfortunately, we're on track to lose a few more this year. Most notable is your kindergarten class. It has gone from 159 last year to 132 this year. And so that is lower than some of your historical information. Although I would tell you, you're not alone. I'm seeing lower kindergarten enrollments in a lot of districts right now for whatever reason. There seems to be actually a population decline. There was an article in the IBJ here recently about the number of births and the number of people passing. The births are not keeping up, so we do have a declining population. And it also may be vouchers. I can't explain why. All I can tell you of the districts I work with, there's only one district that's actually up this year.
Wow.
And so it seems to be a trend that's occurring in the public schools. I've said this to you before, I'm not a demographer, but I do tend to look at some trends and averages. And so that's how I've modeled that out beyond 2024, 2025. And this is the big if you look at 2025, 26, if we get back to 154, which was more in the norm going all the way back to 2020, 2021, you would still lose about 22 students. And so you've heard me say this before as well, we're funded by the number of students we have, not by the number of seats we have. So fewer students makes us less efficient in the classroom. It may look and feel good because we have smaller class sizes, but ultimately we're getting less dollars because we will report our ADM, and if it's down, even though there might be some new money in the formula, will be offset by this decline in enrollment. So students is kind of a key springboard to looking at the financials, especially when it comes to the funding formula. But we're also down in the transfer tuition students. We were at 155 last year, and now we're at 122. So we're really hit on two fronts in the sense that we will lose state support, but we'll lose also dollars that we won't be able to bill for those transfer students. So kind of a double whammy there when we look at enrollment. Now we have a few weeks yet before we get to the actual ADM count, but the early indicator is that number is going to be down. Let's go to page 13 and talk about the assessed valuation. That'd be 15 in the PDF. Yeah, you got it? Okay, that'd be 15 in the PDF. So this is what we've been waiting on. We tried to get together with you earlier, but we did not have the final assessed valuation, and that plays a key role in talking about debt obligations. But we do now have that certified, and I believe it was actually Saturday when we actually got the final number. And so, unfortunately, it is not come in very strong. A little bit lower than we'd hoped, but especially when you look at some of the historical data, you go back to 2024, our net assessed valuation grew 8.1%, the year before 10.13%, and the year before 6.07%. And then the number, there's a line right below that reflects the referendum assessed valuation, which includes TIF. We grew 12.96 in 24, 8.53 the year before, and in 22, 6.91. And even the year before, 12.66. This year, 1.94. Now, this has just been certified, and so we don't have a lot of background to this, although we did get some early indications when they were getting ready to certify that the way apartments are assessed was changing. And many of the assessors across the state were trying to figure out a way to maintain as much value as they could, but maybe that played a role into some of our offset. Another thing that was a bit surprising, I mentioned this last year when I presented to you. In 2023, the supplemental homestead deduction was 35%. In 2024, that jumped to 40%.
And so in 2024, our assessed valuation grew 8.1%, but that was actually artificially low because of that increase in the supplemental homestead deduction. And so I would rough guess maybe about 4% of the assessed valuation was lost to that. And now this year in 25, that supplemental homestead deduction went from 40% to 37.5% and is scheduled to go down to 35 again in 26. So that's what makes it even a little more puzzling why it didn't grow a little more than that, because we would have had just natural growth in because of the supplemental homestead deduction going down. And so those numbers are a bit disappointing, not the end of the world, but certainly not great news. Okay, page 14, the next page. And you've heard me talk about this as well. Page 14, this is a calculation of what's called the 6-year non-farm personal income factor. It's a mouthful, but it is an important calculation because it's used to determine how much you would get to collect in your operations fund. And the legislators moved away from that in the last couple of years, where that calculation used to be pure. They have changed that calculation, have limited that factor for schools to 4% for the next 2 years, that meaning 2024 and 2025. And so even though we go through this calculation, 4% is the number that we're going to see in that levy increase in 2025. And it doesn't matter whether you live north, south, east, west, urban, suburban, rural. This is the number you're going to get, and it's only if you're growing at a certain rate that you have any ability to get beyond that. And obviously, we're not there. And so we will be looking at a levy increase, property tax levy increase in the operations fund of 4%. Now, I will also tell you there is a lot of conversation happening around this very topic at the State House. In the last 2 years, property tax bills have gone up pretty significantly. And I would anticipate in this next legislative session, there will be a lot of conversations about trying to figure out ways to limit property tax going forward. So what that looks like is yet to be determined. They may look at that supplemental homestead deduction. They may try to limit property tax in some other way. Probably the group that they're hearing from the most are retirees. It's the retirees on the fixed incomes that seem to be obviously suffering the most. Even if you just look at, if you look at Social Security data, even in the high inflation years, you saw Social Security go up maybe 9%, but their homes went up 20%. Well, their income's not keeping up with that growth in property value. So that if there was a segment of population, I would say it's the retirees that are screaming the loudest at the State House. And so they could freeze this further into the future. They have already done that for civil units. They have already said no more than 4% for 2026, not yet for schools. But or we could resume back to the original calculation and we'd get 5.3% levy, but I don't anticipate they're going to allow that to go either. So so this is definitely something to watch going forward and what they do with property tax. Page 18. There's a lot of tiny numbers, Michelle. You might have to really zoom in on this one. This is the actual funding formula. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to just highlight one number. If you could, Michelle, zoom in and then highlight those two boxes that I've pulled off the page. So this is the foundation. So this formula was set in the last long session. And so again, foundation is the same amount no matter where you live in the state. Every student starts with this amount of money. And so last year in 23-24, The state increased that foundation amount by 5.69%, which was actually a pretty good increase, larger than we had seen in some other years. But as you can see in 24-25, which started July 1, 24, and will go through 25, June 30, 25, that foundation amount is only up 1.38%. Schools are going to find their budgets tightening significantly in this period of time. Worse yet is that's your foundation amount going up, but we're losing the enrollment too. So Michelle, if you'd go to the right here and let's go to page, I go down to the very bottom of this page, page 22. Yes, page 24 on the PDF. Go all the way down there then. Keep going, please. There you go, right there. So for 24-25, if our enrollment stays as is, up down just a little bit there, Michelle. Yeah, if our enrollment stays as is, and we're getting 1.39%, that means in total new money in the 24-25 budget, we're getting $79,000. And so essentially our revenue is flat in the education fund. And so a lot of schools last year settled some pretty nice contracts with teachers because there was 5.69% new money coming into that. But this year, I think you're going to see schools have a lot less to negotiate into that next cycle. So obviously that won't happen until this fall, but I want you to be aware there are two competing factors on your revenue here. So, and then in addition to that, I already mentioned too, that, you know, our transfer students that we had 155 of that we'll be able to bill at the end of this year, if we stick only at the 122, that's $300-some thousand we won't have in our education fund as well. So we will actually net less money in 25. And the good news just keeps on going. Interest income, which has been pretty strong in this last year, and we haven't seen returns like this for quite a while. But as you've probably read in the news or heard in the news, you know, there is the anticipation that rates will start to be cut, and most likely in this next time the Feds meet. And so that will compete against our revenue too, because right now the education fund's enjoying those extra return dollars. And so just as a placeholder, I've kind of just said, all right, whatever we think we're going to get in 24, that we may get 80% of that in 2025. So who knows what that looks like. Obviously, they've been talking for quite some time about interest rates dropping, but I do believe it's really going to start happening this next time they meet. So with all that said, isn't that nice and depressing to start off with? But I just want to, I mean, some of this I knew last year when we talked. I talked about this data. Obviously, we're hopeful maybe that enrollment wouldn't go down as far as it did. That's obviously hurting us. But I would also say I'm seeing more and more schools looking for transfer students. You know, it's a competitive market out there right now for students. Several of my schools now are, even some smaller ones, are between 200 and 400 transfer students that they're putting into their system to keep those seats full. Again, you know, it may feel good on the classroom side that you have fewer kids in your classrooms, but you need efficiency to be able to pay for those fixed costs going forward. And so that will be the issue that we'll face. So, all right, let's go to page 1 now, actually, after flipping all over, Michelle, it'll be page 3 for you. Just to reflect on 2023 first. You've probably covered this back, and go down just a little bit further, Michelle, please. A little bit further, yeah, right there. And when the most important line on here is over here on the left where it says excess deficit revenues over expenditures. And when you look at 2023 data, actual data, we had a nice gain in our cash balance for a couple of reasons. One, we had a timing issue. Our cash balance actually, we did not get our transfer student tuition, our tuition cash transfer money from the other school corporation. We did not get all of it until 2023. There was just a timing issue. So we collected more to transfer tuition in 23. But that was also the year we went through a significant budget change, and we budgeted more dollars into the referendum fund and less dollars in the education fund because we had such a strong cash balance in the referendum fund. So in one sense, all we were doing is moving some of that cash from the referendum fund back to the education fund. And so when you're looking at the expenses under instruction, you can see where they go from 12 million to $8.4 million. So that was a big drop, but that was part of that transition. And in previous years to that, you had actually been just transferring dollars into this fund from the referendum fund. If you recall, you weren't really budgeting line items into the referendum fund in 2022. You were just budgeting big chunks of dollars and saying, all right, we're going to move $3.5 million to the education fund from referendum. We're going to move $3 million from referendum to operations. And I didn't disagree with that strategy, but we went through that legislative change where we have to start describing how we're spending the referendum dollars. And so we changed the model of how we're budgeting going forward. So there was a pretty significant budget transition from 22 to 23. But nevertheless, we finished the year with $5 million. That is a very strong cash balance. And I would actually anticipate that we're going to see another big increase this year because we budgeted, again, more dollars in the referendum fund and less dollars in the education fund. So I would actually anticipate we'll land somewhere around $6.6 million this year in the education fund. And that's a really strong cash balance. And so the next year, though, you can see the tightening there where our surplus goes down to 442 in that year. And so that's where we're going to start to feel the squeeze of those fewer enrollments and only receiving 1.39% in that foundation amount. Now you have not in the past, and we don't plan to in the immediate future, transfer any dollars out of this fund to the operations fund, but the law allows you to transfer up to 15%. And so there are a lot of corporations that do make transfers out of this. You're very fortunate because you have the referendum fund, you don't have to. But there are a lot of schools that transfer, some all the way up to the 15%. Pardon? Or more in some cases. Yeah, then if you go beyond 15%, you got to explain it. You've got to explain why you're over 15%. But the law allows you, without discretion, to go up to 15%. We're not doing that, but nevertheless, we're going to feel a tightening. My guess is my point. We're going to feel a tightening in the 25 budget, and we may start to see ourselves actually use some of that cash in future years. I'm going to skip the debt page for now, which is page 2, and I'm actually going to go straight to the operations fund, page 7, which would be page 9 in the PDF. Now, we did get some good news, right? Finally, some good news. In 2024, with the higher property values and the higher supplemental homestead deduction, we saw a significant decrease in our circuit breaker loss. And where we were losing almost 30 cents on the dollar to the circuit breaker, that declined to 15%. And that was literally hundreds of thousands of dollars that we did not lose in the 24 budget. And also changes the conversation about debt. Because one of the reasons that we have been reluctant to issue debt is if we did issue debt, we'd no longer have the waiver ability to take some of that circuit breaker loss out of the operations fund and move it to the debt fund. But now our circuit breaker loss is much less. And so it changed the conversation. And we're going to talk about that more later. Also, if you were to go back and look at the fiscal plan I presented last year at the same time in September last year, this is how we had the model set up. We anticipated that we would do the transfer one more year, the waiver, we'd do the waiver one more year in 24, and then we'd look at issuing debt in 25. We knew our debt rate was going to go down in 24, but it was that large circuit breaker loss that we didn't do it sooner. We didn't make a change sooner. But now that we know the real circuit breaker loss for 24 and it's much less, it does allow us to revisit the debt conversation. So when you look at the levy in this fund, the levy in 24 went up 4%, and the levy will go up 4% in 25. Now you see the circuit breaker loss jump pretty significantly there, where it goes from 366 to 674. And the reason being is that assumes that we won't transfer, that we would not transfer any of that circuit breaker loss to the debt fund. You'll see that zero out when we talk about the debt fund here in a little bit. But that makes that assumption. At the end of the year, 2023, our budget was in balance. We ended the year with $2.6 million. And I would anticipate we're going to land somewhere around there again this year. We're trying to watch those expenses as closely as we can. It's been a struggle. This is the fund that has been hit hard by inflation. This is the fund that pays for your utilities. It's the fund that pays for maintenance and repairs. And those are the costs that have gone up pretty significantly in recent years. It also pays for buses, which have also gone up significantly. So this fund in particular, the education fund, you control with how much you give in raises. I mean, ultimately, you control that. But in this fund, there are things in here you can't control. And so when you're getting last year, if you're getting 4% increase in your levy and inflation's at 9%, you lost ground. So I think we can get this fund to stabilize because our ultimate goal in this fund is to try and spend to our revenue. And that's where debt will become part of this conversation too, because there are things within this fund that we can actually lift out and take care of with debt to help relieve the pressure. If we don't do something like that, then you're going to get pressure on the education fund to transfer dollars out of there to help pay for operations. That's where it starts getting into the classroom, is education dollars that you're getting 100% from the state, then end up going into to help fund operations. Now, from a cash position, you're still really strong here again. Michelle, if you can go down just a little bit there at the bottom of the page. I'm anticipating you'll end again with about $2.6 million at the end of 24. And you might say, well, how much should we have? I always look at your next year's property tax collections and being the benchmark and look at half of that. And the reason being is you've got to cash flow yourself from January, May, June when you get the property tax settlements. Otherwise, you're borrowing internally or you're issuing tax anticipation warrants to cover costs. So if you had $2.2 million, at the end of 24, that would be a good cash balance. That would cash flow. You would not have to probably do any type of internal borrowing. Again, the circuit breaker loss is up in 25, but it's much less overall between the debt and operations. Page 8, the next page. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just want you to remind you that we do have a rainy day fund with about $1.2 million in it. We have been appropriating dollars out of this fund without plans to spend it. It's more like a reserve. If something were to happen, something were to crash on you, you have the dollars appropriated and available. You could spend them without having to wait and go through an additional appropriation process. One asterisk, one thing I didn't get updated in the budget of the administration, we actually have $800,000 budgeted in 2025. and I have 817. That number is actually 800. But again, we don't have any plans to spend that. But beyond your education fund, beyond your operations fund, you have $1.2 million in cash. So kind of the summary of those three funds, when you're looking at them, you're in a very strong cash position within those funds. But revenues are going to tighten up as you go forward, and you could start to use some of that cash. So one thing we don't know, obviously, is this next long session, they'll be going through the process of establishing what the funding will be for the next 2 fiscal years. And we don't know that, right? So that hopefully we do better than 1.39%. We'll see where that goes with the state, but it's going to be an exciting session because of what they're going to be talking about, property tax, et cetera. Page 10 is the referendum fund. And we've already touched on this. You can see in 23, you see zeros in expenses here in 2020, 21, 22. That was where we were transferring dollars out. And then you can see where we started budgeting within the fund in 23. But we did spend more than we took in this fund, right? $612,000. That was planned. That was not unexpected. By us spending more out of here allowed us to keep more in the education fund. Same is true with this year. If we spend 100% of the budget, that our cash would go down by $564,000. But you saw in the education fund that we anticipate cash going up. So, and then in the 25 budget, we are out of balance by $1,350,000, and it will be at that point that we will have to start moving expenses back out of this fund. Now we can go through 25. And our cash balance, if we spend all of that budget, would be $4.3 million. Then we're about 50% of an annual year's property tax. Okay, so the expenses that we have in here now will have to start being slowly moved back over to the education side and/or operations side. So that again is where you're going to start to feel some of that pressure. And when you look at the property tax levy, this is a rate-driven fund, right? And so all those nice years of assessed valuation bumps, a lot of it being in that TIF area, this year, 2%, not quite 2%. So your referendum dollars are also squeezing this year. So it's just going to be a tighter year than normal. I'm going to talk about tax rate and then show you what the model looks like with this assumption. But page 12 or page 14 in your PDF. This is your tax rates going all the way back to 2019. And when you look at the total tax rate in 2019, you were 1.2762 in 2019. In 2024, you were 1.1957. That dropped. It dropped mainly because the debt rate dropped. We dropped the debt rate from 0.5375 to 0.4909. And now what you'll see tonight is what would it look like? How much capacity would we have if we took that rate back up to that 0.5375? And a reminder, the reason we didn't do that last year was because the circuit breaker loss. The fear if we would have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, we couldn't take that risk. Now we know a little more. And I think you have a little more room to make that change. But the tax rate dropped 4.76%. And this year, if you did take the debt rate back up to the 0.5375, and you will also see a slight increase in the operations fund rate. And the reason being is if your levy is going up 4% and your assessed valuation is going up 1%, your tax rate goes up. And so your operations fund rate will go up naturally. In a perfect world, if your levy went up 4%, you'd want your assessed valuation to go up 4% because then the tax rate remains flat. So we're getting pressure on, we're going to have some pressure on the operations fund rate going up, but then the assumption then that we would resume back to the 0.5375, which has been the rate for many, many years. Let's see. Okay, so let's go to page 2, and I'll touch on a few things. I'm going to turn it over to the administration to comment, and then we'll go with Lindsay at Baker Tilly to recap some of your historical debt as well as what potentially might be available. We've been trying to manage to that 0.5375, but we have been taking pretty significant losses in this fund with that transfer. And you can see them highlighted there. In 2022, we took a $735,000 loss in this fund. Had we not done that, that loss would have been in the operations fund. Same as the next year, 661. Now this year, the transfer amount is only 280 because our circuit breaker loss is so much less. So now, versus talking about almost $750,000 loss in the operations fund, now we're only talking about 280,000 loss. And we aren't relying on any dollars from any of the old bonds to put in here to help cash flow this fund. So when you look at 24, we're actually going to get, with the rate lower, even with the rate lower at 0.4909, this fund will gain $120,000. Now that's not a lot when you look at the size debt. I mean, this is not much of a cash balance at all. The state will allow that cash balance. Lindsay will talk about this in a moment too, but the state will allow up to a 15% cash balance in this fund of your debt. We're not even close to that 15%. But without the need for transfer from the other bonds, the debt fund would cash flow. Now, with the assumption, if we raise the rate back to 0.5375, and if we have the 2017 bonds, I think you're all aware of that not all the 2017 bonds were spent, and the board at some point in time, I can't tell you what year, it was, I think it might have been even the year before I started with you, the board had passed a resolution saying the leftover proceeds will be used for debt. And so what we can do then is essentially issue debt and then take that $2.8 million and put it into the debt fund to help make the payment. And so you can see where the budget would then go from $6.1 million to that first year, the next year of $9 million, because we'd be spending that $2.8 million that's sitting there, that's sitting in that cash right now. And we'd be able to raise that budget significantly for that year, and we'd be able to capture that $2.8 million for projects. And then going forward, then you would see the debt rate, you'd see the debt payment drop back down after that first year, after we captured that $2.8 million. There are some dollars left over in the 18 and 20 accounts, but those aren't as restricted. Those can be spent on the projects they were originally issued for. These have been restricted, and the only way to get to these dollars would be to issue debt and take that money and use it to make up a debt payment. So I'm going to pause there. I'm sorry. It's a lot in a short period of time. It's a lot of numbers, I know. So in summary, you're in a really good cash position, right? But the caution flag is out for 2025. Lower enrollment, less dollars per pupil, lower at referendum AV. You know, we've taken some hits, and so we're going to feel that squeeze coming forward. No reason for knee-jerk reactions. Let's see where it goes. Let's see how the next session goes. You've got cash to kind of ride that out. So I wouldn't say, oh, we got to start reducing expenses right away. I think we got to see what happens the next session. But you need to be aware as you start to see things change in 2025, why that's happening. So, and you have this opportunity. You have an opportunity in front of you to issue debt to try and take care of some needs, as well as utilize those 2017 dollars that are ultimately just reserved. I mean, you can't really touch them right now. It's the way it's set up. So I'd be happy to answer questions, or if you want to go through the rest of it and then circle back and answer questions after Lindsay presents, that may be the best way. Okay. Do you want to do your,
I just want to
I
make
got a few things to say first.
Sure, of
Yeah,
course, yeah, you guys.
I want to say a quick point to, first of all, thank you, Mr. Reuter. Thank you for the information so far. And before Mrs. Crunk shares additional information, just remember that we are talking about the idea of building in geo bond capacity into this budget. And we know that we had Fanning Howie work with us a couple of years ago when I first got here, when Mr. Reuter recommended we go through the process of a feasibility study. We know that we've got a timeline of projects that need to be completed or carried out that really are focusing on preventative maintenance. And you've got that Fanning Howie feasibility study that we're really pulling this list from. And so with that, we also know that through the work that Mr. Reuter pointed out last year at this time, coupled with what you see in the plan, that it keeps the board's commitment of the 0.5375 rate. You don't go above. We went down. Mr. Reuter explained why temporarily, knowing that we would face a day like today where we were going to come and talk about building in a geo bond, which is what both Mrs. Cronk and I are very used to in previous districts we served in our capacity. But with that, Mrs. Cronk, if you would go through the list and talk us through that.
First, I want to share a little bit more information about our operations fund, with which Mr. Reuter alluded to a little bit. But on an annual basis, our operations fund is used to pay for things like general annual maintenance contracts, our utilities, insurance, and other district central functions, which, as he said, a lot of those things go up quite a bit higher or quicker than other things, especially things like insurance and utilities. After these annual items are paid for, there really is not a lot remaining to put towards larger maintenance projects and equipment such as buses. We've really kind of been keeping it to like one project a year, really. That's fairly lower in cost, not like a really large project. One way to address this that other school corporations do, and as Dr. Greiner said, we both have had experience with that in our former districts, is to sell general obligation bonds. Ms. Simonetto will actually share more information about the general obligation process here shortly, but I wanted to share with you first a list of potential projects that I shared with you that could be addressed with a GEO bond. You were recently provided that list that came from the Fanning Howie Capital Improvement Plan, as well as some input from community members. I'd like to point out that there are several bulleted items that are bolded in red, as we believe they must be addressed within the next 3 years to avoid more costly repairs, or so that they can continue to remain in service without disruption of our operations. The first thing is replacement of the tennis courts, and it's been a topic of discussion for a few years now. Quite a few people have mentioned that to us. They're unable to be repaired, and they actually must be replaced. So we can no longer just resurface them. They do have to be completely repaired. We did walk the area recently with Mr. Daly and agree that replacement is needed to keep them in working order. And roofing is a constant as well. In a school corporation, we're always doing roofs, I think. It's just a constant thing every year. Sections of roofing must be replaced periodically as preventative maintenance. You don't want a roof to go bad and then have to fix it. You do preventative maintenance to keep those roofs in good shape and good working order. We also have HVAC needs across the district as equipment is at the end or past its useful life. And we even have some that are only 5 or 6 years old that are having issues right now too. So that's been fun to deal with the past month. Buses will also need to be replaced over the next 3 years. And those can actually be paid for from a general obligation bond to free up money in the operations fund for other things as well. And then lastly, we also know that Happy Hollow has been a board priority, and thus it has been included on the list as well. So that's just a list for consideration, things that we think are a priority. Obviously, we could add to this list. We can change priority of some things on this list, but that can be a discussion we can have as well. But before we get too far into that discussion, I'd like to introduce Ms. Lindsay Simonetto to speak about the general obligation process. She was with us last when we talked about the referendum, I believe, last July. Yeah, July a year ago.
Good evening. So I've got this presentation, it's on here as well. So with this, we will look at a potential general obligation financing. Before we get into that, we'll look at what your existing bond structure looks like and then layer on that new potential financing. So if you turn to page 3 here, this is a graph of all the bonds that you currently have outstanding. So your payments this year about $6 million for the year, and they range from about $6 million to $7 million through 2038, and then start to step down in 2039, and that's when they're fully repaid. The next slide is just the detail behind that graph if you wanted to see the numbers for each of the financings that are out there. One thing that I did want to point out here, there's kind of towards the bottom half of the page, the call dates. So each of these financings has an ability to be refinanced after, it's usually about a 10-year period. So those are what those dates represent, is the dates that these bonds could be refinanced for interest savings, assuming the market is favorable at that point. So you're a couple years out from some of those. And if you flip then to this slide here, you may not have seen, but the bonds that were issued previously are the first mortgage bonds. So those are lease financings issued through a building corporation. The type of financing we're talking about today is a general obligation financing. Both are bonds, both are ultimately secured by property taxes, but a general obligation financing is a financing that's issued in the name of the school corporation. So there's no building corporation involved, there's no mortgage on the property. So it really has some less steps associated with it. It's a simpler process because of that. But there is a limit to how much that you can issue. And every taxing unit in the state has this limitation to their general obligation bonding ability. And it's tied to your assessed value. And it's this formula here, 2% of 1/3 of your assessed value. So this year, the amount of general obligation bonds that you could issue would be this $8.4 million figure here. But based on conversations with the administration, we're looking here at a financing around $6.2 million to give you about $6 million ultimately of proceeds to attack different projects. So you're not utilizing that full general obligation bonding capacity, but you are using a portion of it if you go this route. This slide here, this is a summary of the pertinent financial information related to it, but I think that the best slide to look at that shows the bigger picture is slide 8 with the next graph. Okay, so the gray bars, those are the bonds that you already have outstanding, so the ones that we went through in the earlier slide. And then the yellow bars represent this additional $6 million that's being discussed. If you look in 2025, you see the patterned bar. That's representing the portion of the payment that would be funded through using those 2017 bond proceeds, applying those to that bond payment. And the yellow that's solid is what would be funded ultimately with the property tax dollars. The other line I want to draw your attention to is the black solid line. That's the debt service tax rate. So last year, it was at that 0.5375, as Mr. Reuter mentioned, dropped down to about 0.49, and then this brings it back to that level where it's been, obviously where it was last year, but also for the last several years. And then it is expected to stay at that level for the duration of this financing, and then starts to step down beginning in 2031. One thing I will note, we did not build in any future assessed valuation growth. So this does have your assessed value for 2025 built in, which we already talked about was not huge growth, but we did not build in any future growth with that. So to the extent that there is more assessed value growth incrementally from year to year, then you would expect that that tax rate for debt service would actually decline with that. The other thing I want to point out is the dotted line at the bottom. So that is the cash balance in debt service. So last year, you really haven't had a lot in that fund, in that cash balance, because you've been utilizing that property tax waiver, the circuit breaker waiver that's allowed you to replenish money and move money into operations. So with that waiver no longer being a factor, this actually gives you some ability to carry more of that cash balance in that debt service fund. The state will only allow you to carry a certain amount. They'll allow you to carry 15% of your bond payments. But what that does provide is it's just some additional cushion if property taxes are behind or a little, if they're short in any kind of way. It just gives you that additional flexibility ultimately to have some of that cash there. It can also help you make sure that you're staying at that tax rate that you've promised as well. So then if we move to the last slide, what we've shown here is a comparison and looking at what this might mean to a taxpayer. So again, going back to, if we were to compare back to where the debt service tax rate was last year and the last several years, that's no change over those typical historical levels in debt service. But it is an increase over the level that is there this year. And so that's what we've demonstrated on this slide. And we have home values here ranging from $150,000 up to $600,000. But the one that I'll focus on there is that $308,000 one, because that is the median home value in the district from the census. So after taking into account the deductions that homesteads are eligible for, the value might have a market value or a gross assessed value of $308,000, but it's actually being taxed on $169,000. So that's its net assessed value or its taxable value. So for that median home, the increase to their bill for this proposed financing would be about $78 for the year, or $654 per month. We've also provided their commercial and rental property, and that is intended to be a multiplier. So we've showed you there per 100,000. Those types of properties don't have those same deductions. So that's a lot simpler to just be utilized as a multiplier versus a homestead property, somebody's primary residence. You really have to look at the value of that and look at those and take into account those deductions. One other thing with this is these bonds, ultimately, they'll be part of your tax rate that is subject to those circuit breaker tax caps. So if any property is already at their tax cap, then it doesn't matter that their tax rate is increasing with this. That really doesn't change what they would pay because they'd be already at their cap. And the properties that are at their cap, really, it depends on what taxing district they're living in. So what are the layers of taxes that they're already paying into? What's the value of their home? So there's the lower value homes probably are not at their cap versus as the value gets higher, those are the ones that are already at their cap more than likely. So I know that gets kind of in the weeds there, but that's definitely an important point. Okay, and this final slide then shows you what your general obligation capacity is over time as you make the payments on these bonds. So one piece of good news here is because you have those additional funds that you can apply to this financing, you're able to make a pretty significant payment on these bonds in 2025. And so you're paying a lot of principal during that period of time, which saves on interest costs, but then also gives you the ability to bring back some of that general obligation capacity so that you have that tool moving forward as well. So today, again, if you look at the far right column, 8.4 million is where your capacity is now. And if this financing comes in, it brings down to about 2.2 million. But then as you make those principal payments over time, that general obligation capacity increases as you make those payments. And so that's that far right column, what that demonstrates. On those dates that you make those payments, that's where your general obligation capacity increases to. And this also does not include assessed valuation growth, so that amount fluctuates with any growth in assessed value. Okay. All right,
Thank
that's
you,
all I
Lindsay.
have.
It's always a pleasure working with you over the years. Lindsay is from Baker Tilly. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that earlier.
So as you've heard the presentations, I'll just, I think we can clear through Friday notes and we'll probably present to you. It is our recommendation that you strongly consider the GO bond option, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Reuter so that we can continue with his part and or answer questions, as he's had indicated he would be more than happy to entertain the board with Q&A.
Just from a timing standpoint, we're at the point where we have to advertise the budget. And so in order to have a hearing September 16th, we have to advertise 10 days prior to that. So it is our recommendation to keep your options open, that we be allowed to allow for a debt payment. You can come down, but you can't go up. And so you could still have time yet to not decide to issue bonds. But if you don't advertise it, you don't get the option. So we have built the budget with the assumption that you would issue bonds. The DLGF, though, if you don't get through the process, the DLGF will remove it. Even though we budgeted and you adopt it, they'll remove it. You actually have to have the bonds issued by December 31st, or they will not give you the tax levy for 2025. So there is a bit of time sensitivity around getting the bonds issued. Just from getting through the process, which the first step in the bond process would be a preliminary determination hearing, which would be also the same night which you would have a public hearing on the budget. Now, the public hearing on the budget doesn't require any action on your part. It's just you're opening the budget up, and if anyone would like to speak to it, they can. But then you're actually having a preliminary determination hearing on the bonds that same evening, or would have a preliminary determination on those bonds that same evening. The budget adoption is actually not till October 7th. But even that, you could adopt the budget, and if you don't get the bonds issued by December 31st, it won't matter if you have it in there or not. But you can come down, you can't go up. It's a one-way street when it comes to the budget process.
And if you did notice, we shared the timeline of the GO bond with you that Ice Miller put together, and that would involve me sending a notice of publication or a notice of public hearing and preliminary determination for the September board meeting to the newspapers this week, just so that you're not surprised if you haven't taken a look at that. But I would need to send out that notice this week for the newspapers to publish next week.
Question? Yeah.
Sure.
Maybe I'll answer this. So you're saying we're going to get total AV. In the model that you did for the general obligation bond, you talked about 2.903 billion. Is that all available for us to tax then, to service the GO bonds? I see you shaking your head no, Lawrence.
The 2.9 is the gross.
I know it is, but that's not gonna feed this. Is it the non-TIF AV?
Actually the net assessed value, and it is non-TIF, and it's also the net assessed value that is the value that gets taxed on and the value that is looked at to determine how much general obligation was.
I saw that comment, the 24 gross assessed value is 2.9, and I'm not sure why that's in there if we can't get it.
That's in there because that's another piece that bond counsel will look at as they're determining, depending upon the size of your borrowing, what process is it subject to. So if it was above, so they always want to know the gross assessed value, because if it's above, you're not looking at a project 19 million. But if it was something over 19 million, that would determine whether or not it was subject subject to referendum, or whether it's a petition for remonstrance, it's just part of that process. So that's really there as a note for, we always keep track of what that is, because that influences process versus the net assessed value influences tax rate and amount of general obligation bonds.
Everything we've talked about today has been based on the net AV. That's just a process
Okay.
number. So,
I just wondered why it was in there, because it's not.
yeah,
not
it's,
getting it.
it's what hoops you have to go through with a bond. It affects that decision.
Okay. And then in your model that you built, Mike, is 25, 26, 27, is that assuming 0.53 on a go
Yes.
forward? Okay.
Yes.
And then your debt service, have you got the geo bonds in the debt service
Yes.
equation? So it's
I
all
use
there.
the same numbers as Baker Tilly has with the existing debt.
Did you go for, what was the number on the geo bond issue principal? Was it
6 million.
6 million? Okay.
Other questions?
Yes, sir.
One more question. Regarding the general obligation bond, do we have a time limitation? Say we can only issue, say, 5 years bond or 10 years or 20 years, something like that?
So it's not a time limitation. Your geo capacity though,
That's the only capacity.
yeah, now, even that, there's ways around that if you can lease, if you need to lease property. And that's how you issue debt for your bigger projects. You went through a lease rental process, different than a general obligation bond. I would say the general obligation bond is a little cleaner, quicker, and cheaper
Okay, that's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
than going through a lease rental process.
Okay, thank you.
And then as you pay that down, that capacity opens back up for you to issue more bonds.
So give us more flexibilities in case we need some
Yeah,
other
so you
thing
would
pop up.
still, under this, what Lindsay had shared, under that, you still had $2 million of geo capacity that you could still access beyond what, if you took $6 million out.
And with the years coming, say 3 years later, we have more capacities to borrow.
Yeah,
Okay.
well, as Lindsay pointed out, that first year, we'd be paying $2.8 million down right away on that principal, which would be coming from those 2017 dollars that are sitting there. And just as a note, it dawned on me, I didn't even think to mention this, but those 2017 dollars that are sitting there, it's going to be earning interest, but the interest goes into that fund. It's not helping your general fund. If we get cash balance back into the debt fund, actually, that interest can be used in the education fund. I said general fund, we'll have it. But that interest can be used in the education fund. So not this huge amount, but say it's $1 million. If you're getting 5%, 50,000, I mean, so.
So we are targeting, say, 6 million, and then we return payback in 5 years, 6 years, right? Something like that. I saw that.
6 years. is
6
what we
years.
model.
And compare with the 20 years bond we
Right.
issue.
This is
I
much
mean,
shorter,
The interest rate is kind of lower, my understanding.
shorter term, yes.
Yeah, yeah, one more question for Michelle. So I saw you have a project list, so I'm trying to clarify, understand what you say is correct. The highlighted with red is kind of a top.
Highlighted in red is what we feel are things that absolutely have to get done.
Okay.
Just because of the shape that they're in, or like I said, the preventative maintenance that we need to do so we don't get ourselves into trouble later on. I mean, there's a couple tennis courts that are getting some pretty major cracks, like down the middle of them. So we do feel like that needs to happen sooner rather than later. And I mean, we've already experienced HVAC issues this year, so we need to address some major HVAC projects as well.
Okay, thank you, just clarify, just make sure I understand. Thank
Yeah.
you, appreciate it.
Is there any benefit, given a lot of the negative things that were shared with us this evening, how things are trending, is there any benefit of just geoing for the amount that we have left in that 2017 bond so that we can free that up? Is that at all
So
of value?
just something to think about. Your cost of issuance is probably going to be pretty close to the same.
Okay,
You know, I mean, let's use $1 million. You can do $1 million GO, but your cost of issuance starts to get out of whack when you're just doing $1 million.
in alignment with the amount you're
Yeah.
asking, yeah.
And interest rates, I was asked this question the other night by a client. People think, well, why would you issue bonds right now when interest rates are so high? Actually, on the bond side,
Not that bad.
it's not as bad. It's not like the homes. I mean, I don't know if you've done one. Yeah, municipal bonds are still much lower than you would go find on a mortgage for a house.
Right.
So,
So my other question is about the projects a little bit. As I went through the projects, I noticed that some of them are curricular, co-curricular, extracurricular, they're kind of all over the place. Has the list been considered in terms of what most impact students? And I asked that specifically with regard to the tennis courts, because I look at that and go, we've got 50 kids who play tennis here. It's an extracurricular. What happens if the tennis courts just aren't done, right? And when we're talking about raising money, and I mean, I played tennis in high school. I love tennis. I'm not anti-tennis, but in trying to understand this from a student perspective, is there the ability to go through and take that eye to it, or already have you done that, or what are your thoughts when you get asked
We
that?
literally sat down with the capital improvement plan and took a look at what needed to be replaced within 3 years, within 3 to 5 years, basically. And I just went through that list, and that's what you're looking at.
So you've looked at it in terms of the condition of the items, assuming we want all items to remain the same, not in terms of use or value to the educational outcome.
I mean, I will say what went into consideration with the tennis courts is I've probably heard about it at least once a month since I've gotten here in 2022.
And really, there's also a community component. I mean, we have a community that has passed a referendum at 80%. And every time I walk by the tennis courts, they're full. And so when you look at that and you think students, it depends on how you think students. I think students of community support. We have this amazing community that supports our schools. And if we say, hey, you don't need those tennis courts, I think that, I don't know what that would look like.
If you do notice the others, we have to have those things to house our students. So those are pretty important. Yeah.
Well, and so my question on that then is, if the real purpose is for community and us having courts means that the city of West Lafayette does not have courts, then why is the city of West Lafayette, why is there not an alternative approach to them to say, hey, these are used by all community members, can we partner with you on this as a part of the
And reaching out to a partnership is a possibility.
Yeah.
So we would just have to see where they were with that, and we would have such dialogue. But I would challenge whether it's 50 students and their passion. We've talked about this before. I just can't apologize as a superintendent and a father of 4. I don't apologize for the tennis player, the choir boy, which was me, right? The football player, the wrestler, which was my son. Wherever their passion and their talent is, I think we owe it to our community to support them.
No, I don't disagree conceptually, but
Okay.
if we're talking about putting a roof on a building versus, or doing something with this building versus tennis courts, where maybe there's another opportunity for partnership, to me, that's where I'm.
I would suggest we're saying the same thing. Yeah, because if you look at the list and you hear what we've done, and obviously you as a board, you're gonna prioritize and guide, but I would suggest we're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
For the track that's at the high school.
And what I would suggest to you, that we value our partnerships, and that if we had anything to say about the ability to do that, we would announce that. And so we don't take for granted the great partnership of our city.
one other thing to think about, you can keep your process going with the bonds without having everything totally pinned down.
Right, absolutely.
So the attorneys can write the bond description broad enough that you can continue this conversation without having all the answers, but just kind of a general idea of, yeah, these are the projects we want to tackle.
And thank you very much for that clear timeline process. It was very helpful to have a refresher on that, so I really appreciate it.
Follow up regarding the tennis court. And actually, last year when I served on the recreation park, and I mentioned the collaboration between ours and the superintendent there, and that they are open to this idea. Kind of, yeah, they sort of can talk about it. And so we may try that approach. In addition, I think I wonder whether it's also possible that we can fundraise for it, maybe name after a big donor for this. I wonder whether that's possible as well, because we have alumni who play tennis, be some of them are willing to, or maybe we can share the cost. Each court is worth how much, and we can give a price tag to it. And I don't know, it's just if we cannot afford to do it, and we can think about other ways. But I totally share what you feel, and this is, this part of the big community. It's not only the 50 kids.
My experience with corporate sponsorships can be complex. I went through a couple of them when I was at Hamilton Southeastern. It seems like your hospitals might be a good target for something like that as a corporate sponsorship for a facility like that. Sometimes they use the health aspect of it, not only from the advertising, but a lot of the corporate sponsorships want to know how many people are going to see this. Tennis courts, you're not going to get like a football stadium. A lot of people want to put their name on a football stadium because it gets so many touch points. But you might be able to use with the hospital a health aspect to that for the community.
Yeah, we can brainstorm with the community, and if we are determined to
any
to
dollars
build it, but we need money to do it.
Right. We help fund some of our football fields that way with corporate sponsorships.
Tennis is more of a lifelong sport than football. You don't see me out there footballing. Any other questions, Lawrence?
Regarding this tax rate, so we are targeted bring this tax rate back from 0.49 to 0.53. So in terms of dollar amount, how much extra revenues we can get from this?
Yeah, so if you go back to page 2 in that fiscal plan, I don't know if you'll pull that back up there, Michelle. So right now, our 0.4909 on property tax generates just shy of 6.2 million.
Okay.
And with the 1% growth in AV and a rate of 0.5375, we're just shy of 6.9 million.
So something like a 700K,
Yeah.
0.6.
Now, the big game changer too is we're not losing anything to the circuit breaker, but we are losing that, we will be losing in
Again,
the
on the
operations
operation,
fund.
I see I look at these bond payback schedules. So it looks like every year, the first year payback from the 2017's leftovers. And then after that, I see we pay back every year something like 700, 800, something like that. So that's pretty much whatever we actual revenues can cover that cost. Okay, so that's what I think that's pretty good. Another thing I'm trying to ask is regarding the interest payment. I saw there you have assumed that's 5% interest, and I saw according to that assumption, the total interest payment will be something like, so basically $1 we borrowed, we pay something like 12 cents for interest, right? 12 cents, something like that. So that's a 5% interest rate is kind of pretty reasonable. Huh?
We do, and we do this to be conservative, so 5% is actually higher than what we're seeing.
Oh, so
in
maybe we
today's
can
market,
have 4% something.
But we want to show more worst case scenario, if you will, here, but yes, with that 5% interest rate built in, the interest expense over that full 6-year period is estimated at that $724,000.
But if interest rate's only 4%, that bond can be shortened.
Also, you prefer that
You
shorter.
could shorten it if you wanted
And then we
to.
can
You could pay
pay
more.
less.
You
Keep the
continue.
rate. Okay,
Yeah,
gotcha.
you could shorten the length of the bond if you
Or you
get,
would just pay more principal sooner, give yourself basically just.
More flexibilities, borrow more things. Yeah.
yeah, you could either lower the payment with it, with a lower interest rate, or you could try and pay more principal up front by keeping the payment higher.
So these so-called GO bond, they don't have any, say like the bond we used to issue, that you have the first 10 years, you cannot pay back.
That's non-callable. That's a little bit different than this. This is what we're talking about when she actually issues the bonds.
Okay.
When you issue the bonds, then it's fixed what the payments are going to be. But right now, until you issue them, you have the flexibility to move it up or lower the payment. You still have flexibility with that payment.
Oh, I see. So these now called, okay.
But once they issue the bonds, then those payments are going to be whatever those payments are going for that 6-year period.
Okay, thank you. I think,
Typically, a municipal bond, you would not have a period that the bonds could be callable or refinanced for the first 8 to 10 years. I mean, you could shorten that, but you will pay an interest premium to do that if you wanted to have the ability to refinance sooner than that 8 to 10 year period.
But for this general obligation bond,
So with this one being repaid in 6 years, that would be under that anyway, so we would have these be not callable. That would
Okay, I
probably
got
be
you.
the best, financially, you get the best interest rate.
So I'm sure when those original bonds, let's take the 17 that Lindsay referred to, you know, they were probably issued with a 10-year call date in
Oh,
them
yeah.
because they're easier. You're not paying as much for them then.
Getting-
The shorter the call date, the more you're going to pay in interest.
Yeah, the banker didn't want to do that, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate this presentation. It's really good one. I really appreciate a lot of details, and also my question have been addressed very well. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So I apologize, I didn't hear. What is it that if we increase the tax rate, debt service rate from 0.49 to 0.53, what is that additional revenue that we'll bring in each
In
year?
property taxes, it's just about, it's going from, I get my glasses on again, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine, I just,
Yeah, so in 24 right now, our property taxes in the debt service is 6.2 million. If we took it up to the 0.5375, it's just shy of 6.9 million. So you're gaining about $700,000 of property tax. You'll also collect a little bit more miscellaneous revenue. And what I mean by that, you'll collect a little more in excise tax, not a huge amount, but excise tax is distributed based on the tax rate. And with a little higher tax rate, it will pull from the pool and generate a little more excise.
okay, help me understand. We'll bring in, if we increase it, we'll bring in an extra 700,000
A year.
a year. But we have, and in addition to that, we're going to have $200,000 in fees, 724,000 in interest over that period as well.
The
If we
700,
take this increase, we're going to have additional interest from the bond as well as fees. Is that, am I understanding correctly?
yeah, it won't be on top of that. What happens is you issue the bond and you pay the professional fees from that. And that tends to be a high number, right? That is a high number. That includes the attorney fees and the financial advisor's fees to market the bonds. And so there are fees, and that's why I was suggesting earlier to do $1 million bond, still have the same fees
Right.
versus doing 6 million, you're getting more out of it. Instead of doing multiple small ones, you know, if you're considering debt, don't do 2 million, then do 2 million next year and another 2 million because you're going to pay fees each time you do that.
So to borrow the money, we're bringing in about 550,000 per year by the time you take out interest and our fees.
No, so 700,000 is the payment. So 700,000 is the payment. That's principal and interest.
No, I understand we're getting the payment, but to get this payment, we've got to take a bond, borrow money that's going to cost interest and fees borrowing the money.
Correct.
So that actually influences, I mean, you can say you can take it from any budget, but it's
Yeah,
influencing
it is a
that.
one-time, so that the fee is a one-time fee. So
Right.
that would be just at the time that the bonds are issued. And then the interest costs are over the full life
Yes,
of the
right.
bonds. Yeah.
Okay. So it does influence
Yeah,
all that.
so let's picture it this way. If you're doing a $6 million bond, if you take 200,000, you're going to net 5.8 million.
Right.
And so you'd have 5.8 million on that project list.
Right.
The interest, the principal and interest, that's part of that stuff. So,
And another question I have, if I understood correctly, is years ago, the board passed a resolution that restricts the 2017 money that we have left over, which is 2.8 million,
correct.
and restricts it that we can only pay it towards future debt. Is
Yes,
that what I understood?
was my understanding of that.
So why can't the board pass a resolution next month that changes that and doesn't restrict it?
Well, you might be able to, I'm not an attorney on that. You would have to get Ice Miller to see how that resolution was written. I wasn't here at that time, so I don't know if that was irrevocable or not irrevocable. But then if you did do that, money would be restricted to only the original 17 purpose, whatever the 17 bonds were. That was elementary. Is
I think
that?
that was the elementary and the intermediate. I have to look that up.
So it would, if they, hypothetically, if that was possible, and I don't know, that's just always been my understanding that that money's been restricted and said it was going to be, it would be used to pay bonds. And so I don't know the history of that, but if you were to make it revocable, then the dollars that are there would have to be used, whatever the description was at that time.
But if they passed a bond to now restrict the dollars to something, why can't a resolution, why can't another resolution be passed that says it can go towards something else?
Yeah, that you can't do because the original bondholders secured the property through the lease rental. They're securing. I'm not, again, not attorney.
No, right, I'm trying to grasp.
Yeah, so- So in a
why
holding
we're
corporation.
Restricted ourselves and then why we're staying in that.
Yeah, so a holding corporation, let's take this room. You
Okay.
issued bonds and this room is under a lease rental.
Yes,
The bondholders own this room.
Yes.
And they don't want you to take money that you had planned for this room and go pay it on the high school.
right,
And so they issued bonds on this room and they want it spent in that area.
but then they passed a resolution that said, we're not willing to do that, we're now gonna take it and pay it towards future debt.
Yeah.
Well, I think what they actually said was that's done, because didn't you tell me we got more? No, I'm not gonna put you on the spot.
Way before me. So.
But there were bonds that were issued and the proceeds from the bonds were actually greater than the amount that had been requested. Is that what this part is?
It does look like that they received premium on all of the bonds, yes.
Right. And so there was, if we're in this room again, they asked for $1 million to do in this room, but they got $1.5 million or $1.2 million, whatever. And so that 200,000 that was left that they had never asked for, you don't pay interest on, correct? Because it wasn't requested to begin with when you get the
No,
premium rate.
it would have been part of the payment. If there were a premium, that's called premium, where they issued the bonds with premium and got extra dollars, that just becomes part of a larger payment. And it would
Okay.
be what we're paying on now.
You pay it, but I don't think, well, anyway. There you go. Didn't increase the borrowing amount. And so that money wasn't necessarily needed to do the $1 million project in this room or the $7 million project at WLS. So instead they said, well, we're going to restrict this money since we don't need it on Cumberland Avenue. We're going to say it has to go toward debt rather than saying we can spend it wherever we want, because that wouldn't be fair to the people who bonded it to begin with.
And that would be an attorney question, to look
Right.
at the original bond documents to say that 2017 bond description said this. And if it said this, you may not be able to go use it at the high school, if that makes sense. It's restricted by that description.
Okay, so could we get more information on that resolution, where it stands and what our options are? Because I feel like,
I'm actually talking to Ice Miller on the phone tomorrow, yeah.
okay, to find out, because it feels like it's restricting some of our decisions, and it'd be helpful to know what options we have, what options we don't have on that money, to me would be helpful to understand.
We'll follow up.
I have a call with Kristen tomorrow.
Okay, good.
One thing I will note, just with any bond financing, when they're issued, obviously there's the purpose that's outlined how it's going to be spent. If you end up with more money than what you were planning to spend on, then the rest is declared essentially surplus, and the only way it can be spent is debt service. So, again, confirm all this with the attorneys, but that's consistent really with any type of financing. If the project is complete and they've done what they need to do with the project and there's money left over, that's the only other purpose.
I'm guessing that's probably what happened when they passed that resolution.
That's what I would think.
That would be my speculation, what happened, but I don't.
Well, I guess I mean, maybe I'm not understanding, but what I'm trying to understand is why is the 2018, 2021, we're saying we have leftovers, we're going to go do projects at those schools that it went to. 2017, we won't take, because we have projects listed at the elementary school and the intermediate school that need to be done. So why can't that money go there? So it's like, why did we restrict our, like, tie our hands? I'd love to understand.
We'll have to dive into
Okay.
it and get more information on that.
That would be helpful. And then did I understand, so if we increase this from 0.49 to 0.53, some property tax, some taxpayers are not going to see any increase because they've already hit their 1%. But what you said is those that have lower home values, they're the ones that most likely are going to be seeing this increase.
They could, based on Lindsay's chart, then you can, depending on the home value, you could kind of speculate what their taxes would go up.
And I mean, I think that chart in some ways is not completely accurate. I mean, it's accurate information, but meaning our assessed value went up. So everybody's property taxes have gone up. Now, in tying to this, it hasn't, but, you know, the community members are saying our taxes already have gone up because we live in West Lafayette School District compared to TSC, our property taxes are higher. So, you know, this amount isn't just saying everything's been held stable with my property taxes for the last 2 years. It's a lot more complicated than just this little bit of increase and who we're putting the increase on.
Yeah, I mean, the pie shifted, and that's why you're going to hear a lot of conversation in the next legislative session. I mean, commercial didn't go up as much, you know, so that residential's paying more than what commercial is paid in the past. So, you know, we don't control that piece of it, right? We don't control the payers. That's a state legislative decision. So I wouldn't argue what you're saying, because that is happening. That did happen. That's why we're hearing the retirees, right, on the retirement side. But it just depends, you know, where they're at in the circuit breaker process, whether they'd see any increase at all. Okay. Now, one could argue, well, the people below aren't even paying 1%. The people at the caps are paying 1%. So they're already paying more.
Right.
So they might be getting up to the 1% where the higher end homes already are.
The higher the value of the home, the less deduction. I mean, you're still getting a higher deduction, but the deduction is not accounting for as much as your total values. The deduction is more helpful for the lower home values because they're getting more of a deduction. It's a percentage of their market value.
I have a question. The 0.5375 debt service number has been that for many, many years.
Yeah, it's
been very consistent.
Since I got it recorded in here, it's been at least since 2018.
Right. So if we were to decide, say that, you know, $50 to $150 was too much to ask of our taxpayers, and we were to let it go all the way down to 0.0001, are taxpayers actually going to get less on their bill, or is that going to just go to the fire department or the police?
It will depend whether it's a circuit breaker or not.
Okay.
And so you could lower the tax rate. So like that rate going down last year, if they were at the circuit breaker, they probably didn't see that.
Right.
Only people below the circuit breaker would have seen the benefit of that lower rate. And when you think about the supplemental homestead deduction going to 40%, the lower end homes really benefited from the 40%. If you're at the higher end homes, you may have been at the circuit breaker, may not have made any difference to you.
Okay.
So even though the circuit or supplemental homestead deduction went up, if they're at 1% cap, they're there. It may not even help them.
But those differences get scooped up by other funded agencies.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. To be honest, there's not been a lot of incentive to lower your tax rate the way the system's currently set up. Now, we did last year because of the risk of that losing the waiver, right? The waiver had just a lot of risk built in on the operations fund. As you heard Michelle talk about, we don't have a lot of room in our operations fund to absorb big losses. That's changed a little bit now.
And so we're not raising anything, we're just returning to our historic rate.
That's right. So when you look at the tax rate, I mean, when you look at the last 2 years, really, I mean, it's really flat. I mean, it went down. If you look at last year and you look at this year, the rate in 2023 was $1.2555, and in 25 it will be $1.2515. So you're really just going back to the 2023 rate.
Okay. Where did that number come from, the 5375? Does anybody remember? Was that just historical?
It was just,
You weren't here yet.
I'm guessing it was a target rate. That's not uncommon prior to the bonds. That makes sense.
We kept the rate the same. It was a tax neutral event.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there are a lot of districts that have what's called the target tax rate, and they maintain to that target tax rate. In some cases, that means the total tax rate. In other cases, it means the debt service rate. And in this case, it meant debt service.
Okay.
Is it, so we dropped last year to the 0.49, which my bet is that means the city, the library, everyone else dropped because the net assessed value was so high that most likely everyone dropped.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, because my question is, what's the likelihood, we go forward and borrow money, other entities borrow money, everybody puts in their budget that we don't actually get even this 0.53.
Yes. Yeah. So
Isn't there a likelihood of that?
I would tell you 90% of the
Okay.
clients that I work with shoot for target total tax rates and issue debt to accomplish that. They
Right.
set all the fixed things up and then
Right.
to issue debt to do that. And I don't know this, but I don't know what the county, if they did that and the city did that. Library, probably not. They don't have just the ability to go out and issue debt as easily. They have to go through another fiscal body. I'm guessing the library rate did drop. It's going to be obviously the smaller portion of a tax rate.
Yes.
But depending on what the county and the city did, if they went out and issued debt, they may have scooped that savings up.
Right. So we're not guaranteed. I mean, others could be trying to take a part of this pie.
Although I would say the big drop in the circuit breaker loss would kind of indicate otherwise, that there wasn't a big shift.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if the tax rate would have gone up, everybody's tax rate would have gone up, you wouldn't have seen the greatest savings in the circuit breaker
Yes.
loss. So the higher the tax rate, the bigger the loss of your circuit breaker. But that would take some research to see if the city, I don't know this, but I think the city actually did issue bonds last year.
Okay.
So, but I don't know that for a fact.
Okay. The projects that are listed, when do we ever have to commit to it until we spend it? Like we pass, we do this timeline, we pass the GO
Right.
bond, let's say it gets approved, and we get the money, what did it say, in December. At that point, have we had to commit how to use it?
If you notice, there's a description of what that project hearing would be for, and it's basically district-wide projects, and so that leaves us a little bit of flexibility if something were to come up.
Okay.
Like I had a chiller that went down.
Okay.
I would then have money to cover that. So typically with a GO bond, you do use somewhat more general language so that you are open to using it for some different things that might come up along the way.
It won't.
Remember, as I mentioned before, we plan for capital projects, whether or not they can happen is a completely different story.
That's another reason and that's a great question, where the feasibility study comes into play. And so she's taking things from there, but there's room in there if we write it generally enough that we are making decisions and keeping a tax rate steady as a responsibility to the community. And then we're covering our projects in a managed way, in an informed way, and we're not going up and down with our request.
And all of these are big enough that I would bring them to you for approval at a board meeting, so.
At what point do you have to write the terminology open-ended of where those projects from the GO bond, what they will be? At what point is?
That will come at the project hearing. That's on that
At
timeline.
that project hearing, this has to be kind of either this way or you'll do it in a more general.
The bottom of the timeline that's been shared with you, that language is actually at the very bottom of that timeline. I believe it was, wasn't it?
Language of just saying the date or?
The project
saying
description.
The project name, yeah. Oh, it's not? I should be able to bring that up for you.
But they do typically write it very generic, so you would have the project, again, this is an attorney, but they would need to weigh in on this. But at the project hearing, you would say, here's what you intend to spend the money on, but you do have a lot of flexibility if something else comes up. So even if the bonds have been an issue, you can still change your mind within that description, which the description is intentionally very broad, especially for general obligation bond, because you don't have that mortgage property that you need to make sure bond holders are taken care of. So that makes general obligation bonds a nicer way because of that flexibility and the money.
So we'll see that wording before, I guess it's October, it says hold the project hearing, that's when we'll see that terminology?
I will share that information with you. I thought it normally is at the bottom of the timeline, so sorry, I was mistaken on that.
Yeah, and it's similar to, if not exactly this, renovations and improvements to facilities throughout the school corporation, including site improvements and purchase of equipment, technology, and buses. So it's.
Okay, just totally
Open-ended,
very broad.
Yes.
general,
But
like
again,
a general
looking at
obligation.
the feasibility study, making decisions based on those timelines that our architects have told us that if we're addressing preventative maintenance items, these are items that are either there now in red, or they're coming up sooner. And so those are the areas of focus.
Because, I mean, I'm looking at the last 3 years of capital project plans. There's ones that have been removed, some that's been added. Like I still don't think I'm understanding the clear, I mean, I understand the priority as of today, but it's like, did we decide we didn't want fencing at the elementary school or the observatory at the elementary school? Or last year it listed temperature controls, or 2 years at the high school. Like, there's been a whole.
And we actually have done that, so.
That one's a done project.
Yeah. Now, there's more that need to be done. We didn't do all of them, but we did do some temperature controls at the high school. Yeah.
Fencing too.
Yeah, the fencing's different.
The fencing was done, but not the, anyways, okay. I think, I guess what I'm not, some of these are new, some of these aren't new, and has principals given feedback, has stakeholders,
To that feasibility study,
teachers?
yes.
Like the teachers there on board, that they think this is more important, because it feels like if we go down this route, we are taking money from education and putting it towards here. We'll be able to spend less money on teachers because now we're going to be borrowing money and having it go towards here. So,
If you have a budget in your home and you have budgeted $1,000 a month for food, and then you have a credit card where you're paying for a new roof, you haven't taken money from the food budget. You've taken money from the credit card to pay for the new roof. I guess
so when I
I'm
have a
not
credit card,
understanding.
I don't carry debt on my credit card, so that money to pay the
Well,
credit card
okay,
goes from
but
something.
school debt is different from personal debt, but I'm just saying that it's not as though we're taking $6.2 million out of the education fund. And yes, of course, we're going to have to pay it back, but we're issuing debt because that's how it's done. Like, we can't just raise money and say, you know, we're gonna clip coupons until we have $6.2 million. That's actually not legal as far as I know. So this is the funding mechanism under which schools operate. And it's possible that it's a terrible mechanism, but it's the one that's available to us legally. Does that make sense?
Keep in mind, of your 6 million, 2.8 million you already have.
Right.
You know, that of the 6 million, 2.8 million sitting in an account right now. So you're really talking about, you know, a smaller amount that you're actually borrowing. You've already borrowed that 2.8 million and paying on it. So
I'm just saying, in the past, we did a major shift from education to facilities when we did the project. And again, if we do this, we will be doing a shift from education to pay for our debt, because it's
actually what will happen is the DLGF, if you don't issue debt,
right.
if you don't issue debt, you hit the 15%, the rate's going to continue to drop.
Right.
So that, you know, as your assessed valuation grows. So again, it's about managing that tax rate and not letting it fall, because you're not the direct beneficiary of it dropping.
Right. So to me, the job of a school board is trying to weigh, where is that balance? What is the appropriate amount to try to use that tax rate, but even though the tax rate's staying flat, it is affecting taxpayers, they're paying an increase. It is affecting our budgets in other funds. It's not like this is just, nothing's going to be changed in education or operations. We're just going to borrow this money and there's no payments. It's just, it's not quite so simple.
And that's
And
why,
so it's trying to balance this, and I think my biggest concern, and I was surprised that, I wasn't totally surprised this came forward because you had given us a heads up last year, but I feel like right now we are doing a strategic planning survey where we're actually seeking feedback from stakeholders, teachers, the community, to say, what are your priorities for our school? And my concern is in April, May, I don't remember when they're coming forward with their final results, is what happens when their results come forward and the community in general has said, we really want more money spent on special education. Indiana is one of the lowest, we don't spend a lot. In our school district, we wanted more special education teachers. This is our highest priority. Well, we've kind of tied our hands on education. Some of the funding, we don't have as much flexibility versus if we wait for 1 year from now, we now have community feedback as we're making these decisions. We also, one of the things listed on here is the demolition of Happy Hollow. I've never been a part of that discussion. There's never been a community discussion about what should we do with Happy Hollow. There's actually never been on my time on the board, there's never been a board discussion of what we should do with Happy Hollow. So I just feel like we have a discussion of Happy Hollow. We've never discussed transfer policy. What is our school district's transfer policy? Are we going to open the doors wider or not? That affects our funding. And also we're seeking community feedback, but so I feel like we're jumping the gun. I feel like this is a year from now conversation that's legit. Now, I know these projects some of these are years overdue. So I feel bad for administration that we are in the position you're in. But that wasn't all of us on the board's decisions to, do the glass facade at the auditorium. So that's, I don't know why they weighed that there, but that's my concern with the timing.
okay, and so what I want to point out is, one, don't feel bad for us, because we're bringing forward a recommendation because we need to. Or like you said, we are in a position where we could be perceived as being negligent, and I would suggest that if we weren't using the feasibility study, working here together to make a recommendation to you, we are being negligent. But I will also say that's where we are at with, remember what Mr. Reuter said, we can't ask for more, but we can cut back. So this is the reason we're putting it in there. And then the board, you have your work to do. You guys will talk, you will make the decision on the direction you're going. And if you did decide that you weren't going forward, we're going to continue to school. I don't know what that looks like as facilities. There are needs that maybe we wouldn't be able to afford. But yes, we could come back to you. And the thing that we're doing with our recommendations, we're not doing new projects. We're looking at, a feasibility study that we put in place, because that's how we operate together, where we're maintaining and keeping a solid, safe, attractive because that's part of good learning, learning environment, whether it's tennis or whether it's football, track, We are going, if the board votes no, as Mr. Reuter said, we can go backwards in funding, but we can't ask for more within certain dates. So the board's got time to do your piece and to be transparent and to make a decision. And if our recommendation is voted down, no hard feelings. We're going to still do solid, hard work with what we have to do it with. But what we're trying to do right now, and is what I know the board would expect us to do, is present to you needs and then the ability to keep the tax rate steady so that we're not lowering it, as Mr. Reuter said, down, then way up, It's steady, and we're keeping our facilities state of the art for the students we serve.
It just recently got brought up using the 2018 and 2020 money for the high school locker room. How much money are in those accounts?
I think it was, about 1.5 and 1.2 respectively, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. But I do have a call set up with Ice Miller tomorrow to talk about the logistics of that money to ensure what I can and can't use it for. Because as you know, none of us were here when that came, so I want to make sure
That's
everything
another
is,
legal
good.
question that we need
yeah.
to answer.
Because, I mean, so the question is, could some of that money be used to this? And where does the locker room fit in on this? Because my understanding from our conversation in April, when we passed looking at this, we were saying the foundation will be raising the funds for phase one. But if I understood correctly, we were just told that we're now going to use our 2018, 2020 to do phase one. So
To add to, because we have to look at first an architect plan to do
Okay.
the bottom floor of the high school, and that's going to be a pretty hefty amount of money, because we're looking at probably, 10 to 12 million over the whole life of those projects, as we took a look at. And so, I mean, architect fees could be anywhere from 8 to 12% typically, I've seen. And so that's going to be a large bill for architect fees. And so, that first project that we talked about isn't just that limited to that amount. You have all those other amounts too on top of that. So, like I said, I mean, it's at the will of the board, but these are options we're trying to look at to try to get all these things that we've been talking about for the past 2 years done and move
no, and
forward.
I mean, I've shared, the locker rooms, I don't know why that wasn't a higher priority years and years ago. But the question is, I guess I had thought the conversation that I had heard, and I'd love to understand better, is we weren't putting forth any money in the first phase. It was the foundation was running with it and raising the funds.
And they have not started doing that yet. I believe they will shortly. We have some other discussions that we have to have with them. This is to get it started so that maybe we could get more done.
Okay, so now coming forward and saying, we changed our mind, we also want to put school district money in to get the first
If there's some
part.
available, when I talk to Ice Miller for it, yes.
Okay,
The
and
the money that was originally penned for that, as you know, in those projects, in the education.
We have not presented anything tonight that assumes that we can do that yet.
we're still trying, because I was wondering, does any of these projects, the roofing, the upgrade at the high school, like any of those, would they fall under?
Maybe.
Any of
And
those?
that's what I'm trying to ascertain
Yeah.
tomorrow when I have that discussion. I really need to know what the
But
details
the only ones that we
are.
counted, that we presented to you tonight were the 17s, 2017 bonds in the
The money
model.
to help pay for this bond
debt
service.
is only 2017 because it has a special resolution.
It had been
that
restricted.
restricts it to that.
It had
Is
been
that right?
restricted. That's the reason we brought that for you today.
Okay.
But we don't have all the answers on the 18 and 20s, if there's leftover dollars, how much flexibility you have with that. But we were, difference in those though too, you don't have to issue bonds to spend those, hopefully. That you won't have to, in this case, you're issuing bonds so you can spend the 17s.
Yes.
And so, although it's very short, you're issuing the bonds and you're paying them in that first year.
Okay. 2018 and 2019 doesn't have that restriction that
We don't know.
Understand. but we
Yeah,
don't.
yeah, it's
none of the board
that, my
members
understanding it hadn't been
approved it?
restricted like that one was.
Okay. Okay. That answers in general my questions.
Anybody else?
Oh,
And to Daisha's comments regarding the potential project list, I wonder whether we can spend some time discussing this and also after we analyze the community feedback. For example, in addition to this, what else, like special education or any other urgent needs we haven't put on it? And also for those we put on it, do we have some alternative ways to address those needs? For example, the tennis court, if we have some other funding source, then we don't have to put it on this project list. And so then we, after we finalize the urgent needs and that cannot be covered, then we can pursue this
The
approach.
way that it's written, what I had read to you before, and as Mrs. Mumford and we discussed it being more broad, the answer is yes. So let's say that I sat down with the city, or that we looked at corporate sponsors. Those are all things that are very viable and real and things that we've kind of been discussing anyway. Yes, that one now of all your priorities is one that's being covered at least partially in one way, and then on your feasibility study or list of those things that need preventative attention, yes, that frees up and the board can manipulate accordingly. And that's kind of where, if I misspeak, correct me, but where Mrs. Cronk was going when she said we wouldn't do any project without, obviously, coming to the board and getting approval. And so the answer, Dr. Yen, is absolutely. You could manipulate, and we would want to, I would think, do it in a way that we're using the data that we have from that feasibility study.
And I guess I'd like to add too that, taking out this GEO bond does not affect our education fund funding, does not affect our referendum funding. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's right.
So if we still decide to spend more on special education, that comes from the education fund. So I would be paying from the education fund for special education things. Now, if there is a $50,000 piece of special education equipment, I could maybe pay for that from the GEO bond because it's used for capital needs. You can't use it to pay for salaries and benefits, things like that. It needs to be used for capital needs. But that education fund money is still there. That referendum money is still there. Okay.
Also, going back to your question earlier, if we're able to use those 18 and 20 bonds on things on that list, that's going to allow you to get deeper into your list with the same 6 million, if you so choose.
Yes, my point, referendum, I know that we're not paying directly, but what happens is we put in buses, transportation in the referendum fund right now. And
I have
if we
them
had
budgeted there,
money
yes.
In operations that wasn't being affected by the circuit breaker with the debt service, we could pull that out and spend more money like on a teacher. So I'm just saying,
Yeah.
all these funds, there is some restriction, but there's also some flexibility. So when we're making decisions on it, that some of the funds, we are making some decisions on others, was the point of.
Yeah, and that's why buses were on your list in this bond though too, so that we don't have to use those referendum dollars.
Yeah.
So that actually puts more dollars back into the classroom if we could pay for them out of this bond.
I mean, strategically speaking, we could be in a much worse position than what's on this list. A lot of other school corporations have hundreds of projects that they can't fund and are taking out GEO bonds continuously every year to help pay for those things. So we're in a fairly decent position compared to other places, but as you can see, there's more than $6 million on here. And then if you add the ground floor on there, and you just keep going, it's never ending. Facilities always have to be continuously.
8,130,000. The only thing I caution about, if you go back in time, you had buildings that were built in the 60s, okay? Part of the high school league goes back to the 40s, and there wasn't a lot done with these properties. So we had a lot of pent-up demand back when we did these bond issues, the total cost of these projects. We hadn't touched these buildings in any substantial way, and we had to pay the price beginning in 2017. That's the price that we paid for waiting. So the point we're trying to make here today is, and this is the illustration, we have enough revenue in the debt fund to handle this general obligation bond, which is enough to cover what our administrations recommend. I'm not hell-bent to the leather to make this happen. The demonstration is here, and the empirical data is here to support what they're asking to do. Now, we can have discussions about whether we want to do it or not, but what we did tonight is assess and prove feasibility. Okay, so that's why we're here. So we can have discussions about a lot of other things, but the purpose of this meeting was to assess them. And that case has been established at 53 cents, which is where we were before this little decrease. In my opinion, we need to get back to where we were. We had a tax neutral case when we issued this debt. Let's keep the tax neutral case. And let's keep using that rate to cover the improvements and that's not even improvements, it's just keeping up. The tennis court is falling apart. But you should have seen these buildings. I mean, the one that we're sitting in, the reason this didn't get renovated is because the deferred was $30 million. That's more than it cost us to build a new school. That's why we went with it. Because the economics didn't make any sense to renovate an obsolete property.
Let me circle back to you on the 49 cents. That wasn't actually our choice. The DLGF actually dropped that rate because they don't recognize that circuit breaker loss in there.
Yeah.
And we would have had a 53.75 if the DLGF allowed us. We got it as high as we could and still allowed for the waiver option. It was all about the waiver option that was driving that.
And we had other changes like unreimbursed textbook going away.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, the DLGF gave us the maximum allowable to us but it goes back to that operating balance, and they don't recognize that circuit breaker loss in their calculations. But now if we don't do that anymore, it's pure revenue in that debt fund. We won't be having any circuit breaker loss there, but our operations fund will be taking it.
Well, I looked at it in the beginning of 24, we've got positive in the fund and then some, even with the new GOBs. It's all good. So we just got to talk about whether we want to do it or not.
And those decisions can come out of future meetings. This one was simply to present the information. The administration is going to go forward with the timeline because there are things that have to happen, and then we'll be voting at our next regular meeting.
There will be a project and preliminary determination hearing
There you go.
in September
In September.
and in October. Would you like it?
In October is the second, there'll be a second hearing, and that's when there will actually be resolutions to take action. That again, you can still pull back from there, but you would pass resolutions that would keep that process.
Okay, so we're not voting tonight, it's work session, we don't do that. But the administration is going to move forward with this process because otherwise we're going to lose the possibility of it. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay.
I have a question on the fiscal plan, just to understand the money and kind of what it's telling us. So like on page 1, page 1. So when I was looking at over the year spendings, trying to just see the trajectories, summer school, we now have put in 57,000. Is that just a message of we're entertaining the idea?
And just like I said last year, that's really just a placeholder. We may use it, we may not use it. And I had failed to do that last year. We had that discussion, so I made sure that I put some in there as a placeholder just in case. And that's what appropriations, a budget is for. You're
Right,
making a
just giving
placeholder for
message
something.
that this is something
Yeah.
we're considering,
Mhm.
is that. What were some of the others? Central services, remind me why it's jumped,
Okay.
like how that accounting.
So that's something interesting. That's a legislative thing that changed here recently. We've had a
And I've
lovely
highlighted that
conversation
one,
about that.
so you
Yeah, I
did
was
see it.
trying to,
I highlighted that
so-
specifically on that page so that you did see it.
The textbook rental fund is going away as of the end of 2024, and everything has to be transferred to the education fund. So any revenue to textbook rental, so those reimbursements from the state will start going into the education fund. I will have to transfer what's left in textbook rental into the education fund. And anything we buy for textbooks, laptops for students, everything has to come from the education fund. So that's why I appropriated about $500,000 to cover, and that's kind of purely a guess because I don't know what's coming up, but it's a placeholder to have it if we need it.
Now, we did budget $100,000 in revenue that hopefully is conservative on the revenue side and conservative high on the budget
there you
side.
go. Okay, so it's that textbook stuff is what that
Yeah,
line item
yeah,
is.
and that is a large part of that difference in the education fund for 2025.
We'll
And
start-
I will explain that in more detail when I do my budget workshop for you in September.
No, that's helpful.
All the schools are still trying, we don't have real numbers yet on this textbook rental stuff. So
And-
we're budgeting conservatively on the revenue and budgeting high on the budget.
And we actually don't have the
side.
details for the process yet. They are supposedly coming up with new accounts for us, but we don't have those yet, even though we're all doing our budgets. So we're just putting it in the 25,520 program code as a placeholder until we find out what we're actually supposed to do.
And then remind me, the community services, it's been all over the map. What's covered under that?
Let me go look.
A lot of times that's your extracurricular stuff.
Yeah.
And 600,000 to 400,000, I mean, what affects these shifts, do you know?
Really, I'm just looking at history
Okay,
of what we actually spent. Remember, this is budget
right.
for
no, I
24 and 25.
Yeah, but when I set a budget, I like to know why I set that budget, like what influenced that decision, so. Okay, let me see if there was any.
And those can change frequently, like if we decide to add, 2 coaches to a particular sport. I
Okay.
probably did not know about that a year in advance
Okay,
when I did the budget, so things like that.
okay, sorry, let me just see. I just got this today, so I didn't get a chance to do.
And I apologize for the delay, as I said,
No, you just got the, yeah.
Yeah, we just got,
Everybody's just-
we wanted to get it to you sooner, but we were on hold, sorry.
And you can feel
Yeah.
free to ask more questions about this in September too, so that you
Okay,
have more
because you'll
time.
be
Yeah, because
sharing
I'll be doing my budget workshop at
The
that point.
same thing we just,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, so this reflects the budget of the administration, but again, this is just a model. This is not a required document.
No, yeah, it's just helpful for me to understand
Yeah,
what decisions.
this document is just a planning document,
Yeah,
a
which is
model to help
helpful,
you kind of
yeah.
see historically what's been happening, where we are, and where are we going.
Yeah, no, I just want to
He
understand.
does a great job of giving a better level of understanding so you can ask those questions.
Exactly, no, I appreciate it. I think my only last one, well, maybe one more, the land acquisition, remind me why, last year I was remembering, there was some comment about parking lots and stuff. and it
Yeah, land
didn't really
acquisitions
make-
for parking lots and such, and so that's kind of a placeholder to have it there in case we need it.
So land acquisition and development is strictly taking care of our
Parking lots, things outside, yeah, things like that, yeah.
Anything outside or?
So like salt for the parking lots
Okay.
comes from like that ground, no, that's grounds, maintenance of grounds. But yeah, land acquisition is typically like parking lots and sheds and things like that.
Okay. Great. I think that was all my questions at this point. Thank you.
Is everybody good? Great. Thank you both all very much for
pleasure.
your time and your work on this, and we'll see you in September.